I need to tell you something, I said. I was sitting alone in my study, speaking to the empty room, but I knew my children would hear this recording someday. They had to. I'd conquered impossible dreams, but this conversation felt harder than anything I'd ever done. The silence around me was deafening. My final wish isn't what you think it would be, I continued, staring at the flickering candle I'd lit moments before. The flame danced exactly like the ones my grandmother used to light during her evening prayers. She'd kneel by her bed, whispering words I couldn't understand as a boy, her weathered hands clasped together. I never understood why she prayed for peace instead of success. Now I do. The recording device blinked red, capturing every word. I'd put this off for months, but the doctors had been clear. Time was running out and there were things my children needed to know, things I should have told them years ago. I wasn't there for you the way I should have been, I said, my voice cracking. I chose training over bedtime stories. I chose competitions over school plays. I chose building my body over building memories with you. The candle flickered, and for a moment, I saw my grandmother's face in the flame. She'd been gone for decades, but her influence never left me. Even during my darkest moments when failure seemed certain, I'd remember her prayers. She wasn't asking God for money or fame. She was asking for peace. There's something about faith that I never told you, I continued. Something I've carried with me since I was 7 years old. Watching grandmother pray every night, she taught me that success means nothing if you lose your soul in the process. I paused, remembering how she'd always save a piece of bread for anyone who might be hungry, how she'd smile at strangers on the street, how she'd forgive people who hurt her. She had so little, but she had everything that mattered. I'm recording this because I need you to understand my final wish. It's not about trophies or legacy or changing the world. It's about something much more important. The candle flame grew brighter, casting dancing shadows on the walls. I could almost hear my grandmother's voice, soft and gentle, reminding me that God's love never fails. She'd whisper those words when I was scared, when I doubted myself, when the world seemed too big and too cruel. I want you to know the God who carried me through everything, I said, tears streaming down my face. The God who gave me strength when I had none. The God who forgave me when I didn't deserve it. The God who never stopped loving me even when I was too busy to love him back. The recording device continued to blink, capturing every breath, every pause, every moment of vulnerability. This wasn't the version of myself the world knew. This was the real me, the one who still prayed by candlelight when no one was watching. I know this might surprise you, I whispered, but it's the most important thing I'll ever say. The candle burned lower as I continued speaking into the device. Each word felt like it was being pulled from somewhere deep inside me, a place I'd kept locked away for too long. I remember Catherine's first dance recital, I said, my voice heavy with memory. She was barely 5 years old, twirling across the stage like a tiny angel. I was in the gym, supposedly preparing for a crucial competition, and I missed it entirely. By the time I got home, she'd already gone to bed, her costume carefully hung in the closet. The silence that followed was unbearable. How many moments like that had I missed? How many times had I chosen the urgent over the important? Patrick used to draw pictures of us together and stick them on the refrigerator. Little crayon drawings with "For Daddy" written in wobbly letters. I'd glance at them between protein shakes and checking training schedules, never really seeing them, never really seeing him. I stood up and walked to the window, still speaking toward the recording device. The city lights twinkled below, each one representing someone's life, someone's family, someone's dreams. I'd spent so much time trying to be the strongest man in the world that I'd forgotten to be present for my own family. Christopher asked me once why I worked out so much. He was maybe 8 years old, standing in the doorway of my home gym in his pajamas. "Don't you want to play with us?" he said. I told him I was training to make the world better for him. He looked at me with those big innocent eyes and said, "But I just want you to be here." The memory hit me like a physical blow. I'd rationalized everything back then. I was building something important, something that would matter. But what I was really doing was running from the responsibility of being fully present as a father. I think about my grandmother's prayers every day now, I continued, returning to my chair. She'd asked God to help her be patient with her grandchildren, to help her show love even when she was tired, to help her forgive her own mistakes. The candle flame danced higher, and I could almost smell the lavender soap my grandmother used to wash her hands after her evening prayers. She'd kiss my forehead and whisper, "God loves you more than you'll ever know." I'd roll my eyes, eager to get back to my weights and dreams of the future. I never prayed for patience with you kids, I admitted. I never asked God to help me be a better father. I just assumed I could figure it out on my own, the same way I figured out everything else. The recording device blinked steadily, a small red light in the growing darkness. I'd built muscles that could lift impossible weights, but this simple machine felt like the most important technology I'd ever used. When Maria died, I stopped, the words catching in my throat. Even now, decades later, talking about losing my first wife felt impossible. When we lost her, I blamed God. I stopped praying. I stopped believing that faith could coexist with strength and success. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. The candle was burning lower now, wax pooling at its base, but my grandmother's faith wasn't about understanding everything. It was about trusting that love is stronger than fear, that hope is stronger than despair, that forgiveness is stronger than regret. The room seemed to grow quieter, as if the world itself was listening. I'd given countless interviews, spoken at bodybuilding events, shared my thoughts with millions of people, but this conversation felt different. This was the most honest I'd ever been. I want you to know that everything I did, every choice I made, was because I love you, I said, but love isn't enough if you don't know how to show it, and I'm afraid I never learned how to show it the way you needed me to. The candle was half gone now, its light casting longer shadows across the room. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a small, worn Bible. The leather cover was cracked and faded, held together by a rubber band that had lost its elasticity years ago. This was my grandmother's Bible, I said, holding it up to the recording device as if my children could see it. She read from it every morning before sunrise. I used to think she was wasting time, that she could be doing something more productive. I opened the book carefully, its pages yellowed with age. Little notes were scribbled in the margins, written in my grandmother's careful handwriting, words of encouragement, prayers for family members, reminders of God's promises. She wrote your names in here, I said, finding the page where she'd recorded our family tree. Even before some of you were born, she was praying for you. She believed that prayer could reach across time, that love could transcend death. The discovery had shaken me when I found it after she passed. There, in her careful script, were the names of children I hadn't even had yet. How had she known? How had she prepared prayers for grandchildren she'd never meet? She used to tell me that God's love isn't something you earn. I continued, it's something you receive, like sunlight or rain. It's always there, whether you notice it or not. I flipped through more pages, stopping at passages she'd underlined, verses about forgiveness, about love, about second chances. Her notes in the margins revealed a woman who struggled with doubt just like everyone else, but who chose faith anyway. I found a letter she wrote to me, I said, reaching for another paper in the drawer. She wrote it before she died, but I didn't discover it until last year. She said she was worried about me, about how I was raising my children. She said she prayed every day that I would remember what really matters. The letter was short, written in the same careful handwriting as her Bible notes, but every word carried weight. Every sentence revealed a heart that understood both human frailty and divine love. She wrote, My dear Arnold, success is not measured by what you build, but by what you become, and you cannot become who God intends you to be unless you learn to be still and listen for His voice. I had to pause, overwhelmed by the truth of her words. I'd spent my entire life building, training, pushing forward, but I'd never learned to be still. I'd never learned to listen. She ended the letter with a prayer, I said, my voice barely steady. She prayed that I would find my way back to the God who loved me as a child. She prayed that I would teach my children to walk in faith, not just in strength. The candle flickered again, and I wondered if it was a sign, a reminder that time was running out, not just for the candle, but for me, for this conversation, for the chance to make things right. I think she knew that I would need this someday. I continued. She knew that all my achievements would feel empty if I didn't have faith to anchor them. She knew that I would realize too late that the most important things in life can't be built or bought or conquered. I closed the Bible carefully, keeping my finger on the page where she'd written my children's names. The simple act of holding her Bible felt like holding her hand again, like receiving her blessing one more time. She believed that every person is created for a purpose, I said, but she also believed that we can't fulfill that purpose without God's help. She used to say, you can't light a candle with a candle that's already burned out. The metaphor hit me with fresh force. I'd been trying to light up the world while my own spiritual flame had been dying. I'd been trying to give my children everything except the one thing that mattered most, a relationship with the God who loved them unconditionally. My grandmother's final wish was that I would come back to faith. I said, "Now my final wish is that you will discover the faith I lost and found again." The candle was burning dangerously low now, but I couldn't bring myself to light another one. There was something appropriate about conducting this conversation in growing darkness, about letting the light fade as I shared the darkest parts of my journey. I spent years angry at God, I said, my words echoing in the quiet room. After we lost Maria, I convinced myself that faith was a luxury I couldn't afford. I threw myself into training, into competitions, into anything that would distract me from the pain. The memory of those dark months still haunted me. I'd been so consumed with grief and rage that I'd barely noticed how my other children were struggling, too. They needed their father, but I was too busy fighting with God to be present for them. The doctors tried to get me to go to counseling. I continued. They wanted me to process the loss, to find some way to heal. But I was convinced that healing was weakness, that the only way forward was to work harder, to achieve more, to prove that I was stronger than the pain. I stood up and walked to the bookshelf, running my finger along the spines of books I'd collected over the years. Fitness, philosophy, biography, everything except the one book that might have helped me understand what I was going through. I remember the exact moment I realized I'd been wrong. I said, it was 3 years ago during a meeting about youth fitness programs. Someone mentioned how their grandmother had always prayed for them to use their strength to help others. The comment hit me like lightning. The memory was crystal clear. I'd been sitting in a conference room, surrounded by fitness experts, discussing the future of youth athletics when this simple comment about prayer had stopped me cold. For the first time in decades, I thought about my grandmother's prayers. I left the meeting early, I said, returning to my chair. I drove to the cemetery where my grandmother is buried. I hadn't been there in years, but I found her headstone immediately. It was covered in weeds, forgotten and neglected, just like my faith. I pulled out my phone and showed the recording device a photo I'd taken that day. The headstone was simple, just her name and dates, but someone had carved a small cross at the bottom. Even in death, her faith was visible. I sat there for hours, talking to her gravestone like she could hear me. I continued. I told her about all my achievements, all my failures, all my regrets. I told her about my children, about how I'd failed them as a father. I told her about my anger at God, about my inability to forgive. The sun had been setting as I sat there, and the golden light filtering through the trees had reminded me of the candlelight from my childhood. For the first time in years, I'd felt something like peace. I started going to church again, I said, not regularly, not with any great conviction, but occasionally. I'd sit in the back, listening to sermons about forgiveness and redemption, wondering if it was too late for someone like me. The church I had chosen was small and unpretentious, filled with ordinary people seeking extraordinary grace. No one recognized me, no one asked for autographs or training advice. I was just another broken person looking for healing. The pastor talked about prodigal sons, I said, about children who run away from their father's house, who waste their inheritance, who think they've gone too far to come back. He said that God's love isn't diminished by our failures, that His grace is bigger than our mistakes. I'd cried during that sermon, surprising myself with the depth of my emotion. The tears had been building for decades, held back by pride and stubbornness and fear. But in that small church, surrounded by strangers, I'd finally let them flow. I realized that my grandmother's prayers hadn't been wasted. I said, she'd been praying for this moment, for my return to faith. She'd been praying for you kids, for your future, for your relationship with God. She'd been praying for redemption. The candle was almost gone now, its flame struggling to stay alive, but somehow that made the conversation feel more urgent, more important. Time was running out, and there were still things I needed to say. I want you to know that coming back to faith didn't make everything easy, I said. I still struggle with doubt, with regret, with the weight of my mistakes, but I'm no longer carrying that weight alone. The candle finally died, leaving only the glow from the street lights outside. I sat in the semi-darkness, feeling the weight of everything I'd shared so far, but the hardest part was still coming. I need to tell you about the prayer I prayed last week, I said, my voice barely audible. It was the hardest prayer I've ever prayed, and it changed everything. I reached for my phone and turned on its flashlight, casting harsh shadows across the room. The artificial light felt cold compared to the warm glow of the candle, but it would have to do. I was in the hospital for some tests. I continued. Routine stuff, or so I thought, but the doctor's expression when he came back with the results told me everything I needed to know. The memory of that conversation was still fresh, still painful. I'd been through difficult moments before, but this felt different. This felt final. He said I had maybe 6 months, maybe less. I said, cancer, aggressive, too advanced for treatment. He used words like palliative care and making arrangements. I heard him talking, but all I could think about was how little time I had left to make things right. I'd sat in that sterile hospital room, staring at the ceiling tiles, feeling the weight of my mortality for the first time. All my plans, all my training goals, all my dreams for the future suddenly felt insignificant. I called each of you after I got home. I said, but I couldn't bring myself to tell you about the diagnosis. Instead, I made small talk, asked about your lives, pretended everything was normal. I was too scared to have the real conversation. That night, I'd sat in the same chair, staring at the same wall, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt. All my success, all my achievements, all my trophies, none of it mattered when faced with the reality of death. That's when I prayed the hardest prayer of my life. I said, I didn't pray for healing, though I wanted to. I didn't pray for more time, though I desperately needed it. I prayed for forgiveness. The words had come slowly at first, rusty from years of disuse, but as I continued praying, something inside me began to shift. The anger I'd carried for so long started to dissolve, replaced by something I could only describe as grace. I prayed for forgiveness for being absent. I said, for choosing training over family, for thinking I could do everything on my own, for wasting so many years running from the very thing that could have saved me. The prayer lasted for hours, or maybe minutes. Time had seemed suspended as I poured out decades of regret and pain. I'd confessed things I'd never told anyone, admitted failures I'd never acknowledged, accepted responsibility for hurts I'd caused. But then I prayed for something else. I continued. I prayed that you would find the faith I'd lost. I prayed that you would know the God who loved you before you were born. I prayed that you would discover the peace my grandmother found in those candlelit prayers. The prayer had transformed me in ways I couldn't fully explain. The fear was still there, but it was accompanied by something else. Hope. Not hope for a miracle cure, but hope for redemption, hope for meaning, hope for a legacy that mattered. I realized that my final wish wasn't about me at all. I said, it wasn't about being remembered or honored or celebrated. It was about making sure you knew the most important thing I'd ever learned, that God's love is real, and it's stronger than death. I stood up and walked to the window again, looking out at the city lights. Each light represented a life, a family, a story. How many of those people were struggling with faith? How many were running from God like I had been? I want you to know that I'm not afraid anymore. I said, not of death, not of judgment, not of the unknown. I'm afraid of only one thing, that you'll spend your lives the way I spent mine, believing that success is enough, that achievement is all that matters. The recording device continued to blink, faithfully capturing every word. This little machine would carry my voice to my children long after I was gone. It would deliver the message I'd been too scared to give them in person. My grandmother used to say that faith isn't about having all the answers. I said, it's about trusting that someone else does. It's about knowing that you're loved even when you don't feel lovable. It's about believing that your story isn't over, even when it feels like it is. I returned to my chair and picked up the recording device, holding it close to my face. I'm going to tell you my final wish now, I said, but first, I need you to understand that everything I've shared tonight is true. Every word, every memory, every tear. This isn't a performance or a publicity stunt. This is a father's heart broken open and offered to his children. I held the recording device steady, knowing that the next words would be the most important I'd ever spoken. My hands were shaking, but my voice was clear. My final wish is this, I said, pausing to make sure every word was distinct. I want you to know the God who carried me through everything. The God who loved me when I was unlovable. The God who forgave me when I didn't deserve it. The God who never gave up on me, even when I gave up on him. The recording device seemed to glow in the darkness, carrying my words into the future where my children would hear them. I imagined them listening, processing, maybe even praying for the first time in years. This is my final wish, I said, not that you'll be successful or famous or wealthy, not that you'll change the world or solve impossible problems, but that you'll know God. And in knowing him, you'll discover who you really are. In the distance, Church bells began to chime midnight. A new day was beginning, and with it, new possibilities for grace, for redemption, for the kind of love that transcends death itself. My grandmother's prayers had finally been answered. I had come home.